Hey, so welcome to the first episode of The Hard Truth About B2B e-commerce. It's our new podcast that we just started to try and help businesses sell through e-commerce to other businesses, which is what B2B e-commerce is all about. So I'm one of your hosts, Isaiah Bollinger, CEO of Trellis. I'm here with Timothy Peterson from Biz Sports. Yeah, we just want to kind of get into it and introduce ourselves. So Timothy, yeah, go ahead.
It's a pleasure, Isaiah. I'm so glad we're launching this together. I've really been looking forward to it, and it's certainly filling up a need out in the community. I don't really know of any other podcasts of any sort in B2B commerce right now. So glad to be doing this. And I am the CMO and the Chief Digital Officer for Sports Biz, and we're based in New York, but I'm working from home just like everybody else for now. So it's great to kick this off.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good way to get some content and some value out there while we're stuck at home. So yeah, I mean, that's a big reason that I wanted to start this. I kind of looked out for podcasts and, there's a ton of e-commerce stuff out there. There's some great like Shopify podcasts, great B2C podcasts, but they're more focused on kind of retail consumer. I did find two B2B podcasts. One of them was discontinued and one of them was kind of not very consistent. And I don't even think I could find it on iTunes. I found it on their website. So there's some stuff out there, but it wasn't readily available and there wasn't much. And it didn't feel like there was really a whole lot of great resources for B2B companies. And so I think a lot of them are kind of in the dark and they don't necessarily know what to do.
So it won't be too hard for us to be the best.
Yeah, I wanted to, choose something that was, achievable. I felt like the regular e-commerce podcast was getting competitive. So I think we'll be able to we could definitely be the top B2B podcast, B2B e-commerce podcast pretty quickly, I think. So, yeah, just to complete the intros, I'm the CEO and founder of Trellis. We're a digital agency that does e-commerce services on platforms like Magento and Shopify and various other platforms like BigCommerce. And we work with both B2C and B2B companies. And we've done a lot with B2B and we want to help B2B companies, which is the goal of this podcast. So yeah, let's get into it. The first topic that I wanted to address is just kind of why we wanted to start this podcast, which we're kind of already getting into. But maybe to take that a little bit further, Tim, what do I feel the reason I wanted to start this, I guess, let me start there, is that I felt like B2B companies have a harder time executing on e-commerce than B2C. I think it's more complicated. There's not as clear of a roadmap. I think with B2C, you can kind of get up and running on Shopify pretty easily, set up your products and add to cart. It's more of a simpler purchasing experience and you can at least get up and running relatively. I feel like the playbook is more concrete and more solidified, whereas with B2B, the playbook, I don't think there is necessarily a perfect playbook. It's not as cut and dry, and I think it's not as clear as what they need to do because they're so unique in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the reasons, the core reasons I wanted to do this is, it's really something that I've learned at being in B2B and having been in B2C. I've been in both, and I really do think you're right that there are a lot more resources and there are bigger communities built around B2C commerce, so people can, share ideas. There's a bigger ecosystem, let's say. In B2B, I don't think that we're really there yet. It's not quite as mature, I would say. The communities, and there aren't as many resources out there. So I think we just need to add to it and to help.
Yeah, absolutely. Out. Yeah, it's definitely not as mature in so many different ways, and there's so much that goes into it that makes it difficult for companies to execute on. So, yeah, I think we're on the same page there. So. I think the next thing that I wanted to just touch upon is what are some of the trends that you're seeing in B2B e-commerce? Like, I think we can say we're kind of coming into this new decade. You had the past decade, which I think was a little bit more about kind of people getting started with B2B e-commerce. And now I think we're seeing we really need to do this. There's more like kind of urgency from companies. So
yeah, I see a couple trends out there. One of the trends is is really the embrace of social media. That's something that B2B was slower at. They really were behind B2C. And up until even a few years ago, there were major B2B players that I knew personally who were really not participating fully in social media. And that was a mistake. And it's something that they've tried to correct, and it's still something that's developing. I'd say number two, one of the things that I see is a lot of B2B businesses are not, they're not communicating in the same ways that B2C businesses communicate outside of social. So for example, they're not doing the type of email programs that B2C businesses do. They're not doing, let's say, this is in a different time outside of our current COVID-19 crisis, but they're not doing pop-ups in the same way when they could. They're using traditional trade shows still a little too heavily, instead of being involved in ways that B2C has learned can be hybrid situations to help out a B2B player. So I think there are a lot of different things like that, including ongoing digitization, just really learning how to take advantage of all the tech and the tools that are out there and to use them to their advantage. B2C is still ahead of most B2B players in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And just to add to that, I mean, I think what makes it challenging for B2B is the social media aspect that you brought up.
Mm-hmm.
The B2C, like I said, I think the playbook is a lot easier. You can kind of brand yourself on Instagram and just kind of target these consumer. Maybe you have a specific kind of segment that you're going after on Facebook or Instagram or LinkedIn or whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Instagram maybe isn't as effective, I would say, for probably most of these B2B distributor type companies or manufacturer companies that might not be selling a exciting product per se. So what are you seeing as some of those channels that are being effective?
Well, I'm going to challenge you on your assumption there. B2B players, I think a lot of B2B players are surprised at how successful they've been in places like Instagram. And I'll just give you a quick example.
Sure.
There was an LED lighting company I worked with for quite some time. They were great, love them, and they have B2B and B2C components to their business. And they had a pretty lively Instagram presence for B2C. And they put a wall up and they said we were not doing it for B2B. Well, as soon as they started putting some explanatory videos or meet the researcher, meet our scientists, this kinds of thing to engage people on Instagram, it did help their B2B side. They were getting brand new customers through Instagram in a verifiable and inexpensive fashion, mostly from just posting content that they were ordinarily going to create and put in other places. But they put it on Instagram, people are out there anyway, and it worked. So I think that that's something that folks have got to consider. And to answer the other part of what you're proposing there, where do you do it? LinkedIn is great, but for a lot of businesses, it's finding a more specialized community. So if you're in fashion, but you're not just putting things out there for the consumer, you have to figure out where are all of those production facilities communicating about fabric and about the latest things that are going on. It takes a little more work because it may not be LinkedIn. It may be through a trade association, social media community, that kind of thing. For example, there's a group called ITAC. They work with manufacturers, and that group is very valuable to all different kinds of manufacturers in different categories. You just have to find your community through ITAC and then communicate socially through that. So there are a lot of different things that players can do.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, that's really smart. And I think you're right. I think there's a play for everyone, no matter how boring you might think your industry is. I think there's a way to kind of reach an audience digitally through some sort of mean of social media, or forum or whatever it may be. It might be a little bit more niche. So I totally agree with that. I think some of the trends that we're seeing too, like on more of a technical side or just kind of operational side, is I think a lot of companies have struggled with B2B e-commerce because they're stuck in this legacy paradigm where they have everything in their ERP system.
Yep. And
it's all in, Microsoft Dynamics or SAP or Info or all these systems. And most of those systems don't really have a modern e-commerce system. some of them we're seeing like, or companies have had, maybe they built an e-commerce kind of on top of that. And there are some, legacy e-commerce platforms on those kind of e-commerce or ERPs. So you see these kind of like old B2B sites on these ERP systems. And I think companies are finally realizing like, hey, we need kind of like a more modern experience on a platform like Magento or Shopify or BigCommerce, or we're actually seeing like companies starting to consider Shopify for B2B. And I know that it lacks some of the B2B functionality, but they're realizing more consumer focused experience might actually help them. So I think that there's a trend of people kind of starting to realize like, oh, people like businesses want that consumer experience, and we need a platform that allows for that. And for a lot of these companies, that's getting onto a Magento or, whatever it may be, BigCommerce or something like that. But then now they have this challenge of integrating the ERP. And so I think people are starting to get a little bit smarter about, hey, like, how do we do this? How do we kind of marry these two systems in a smart way? And that's a lot of the work that we've been doing.
Well, you brought up two really great topics that I think we can explore, further in future episodes, because really there is a trend, as you just pointed out, where it's the consumer and the B2B commerce platform, really thinking of these things a little more together. Right. There's no reason, because, we're all consumers. I mean, I think that's something that I always come back to when I talk to people about B2B. We're all consumers, every single one of us, no matter what business we're in. So even if I work my entire career in B2B, I'm also performing B2C functions on a regular basis. I go to a store, I'm a consumer, right? I just buy something, right? And there's no reason I can't have the same expectations or use the same tech or have the same feeling about things in B2B. I shouldn't have to do what people did until very recently, like filling out a form and scanning it or faxing it, or these sorts of things that a lot of B2B companies were still doing. There's no reason for that. I can easily fill out something online for B2C, and why can't I do that for B2B, right? So it's
absolutely. And Amazon's done such a good job of that. I mean, one of their fastest growing segments is their B2B program. Like, we're actually a B2B customer. We converted our account to B2B, like a Trellis account, which actually you can do pretty easily. And they're starting to kind of build up that functionality, but the experience is pretty much the same as if you're just buying as a consumer. And they're like, hey, this is the B2B pricing that you get as being a business. And it's still not very clear like what the discounts are and why you're getting those discounts, but I think
that's Amazon.
I think they're moving in that direction. So the other trend that kind of goes hand in hand with that is, I think, as they're making this shift to this more modern e-commerce experience and system, or whatever that they decide that to be, I think they're realizing, oh crap, like, our product data needs to be modern for the consumer. So I think we're seeing this kind of mentality shift where it's like, oh, wow, there's this whole product data exercise and operational challenge of modernizing our product data from, in the past they had like SKU and part number and, the price and some basic information about or they had like these info sheets in a PDF or whatever. And then they would have their paper catalogs, right? But getting that to like a modern kind of product page experience where you can see all the information about the product and see more information and kind of like get that, whatever you want to call it, Amazon product experience, I think is a big hurdle for a lot of these companies. And we're seeing that a lot of companies are starting to realize like, hey, well, now do I need an external system like a PIM, like a product information management system? So I think some B2B companies are starting to even realize that something like Salsify might help them because their current ERP isn't quite equipped for that, or they're customizing their ERP in a way that it does allow for that. How do we manage product data from like a more consumer focused like mindset in terms of displaying it on the e-commerce? And it could also just be doing it on the e-commerce site. So that's another big trend that we're seeing.
I've seen it as well from a number of perspectives. I mean, one of the things that's fascinating to me is that you're right, B2B companies didn't even think of naming a product in a sense. Like some B2B companies, let's say they were selling certain types of chemicals or metals or what have you.
Just like part 1, 2, 3.
Yeah, exactly. So it was this long letter and number codes and had meaning in a certain way. And people who were in that system, maybe they memorized those, long letter codes and, number codes. But that's not the way it works now, right? So a lot of companies that are B2B today, they've learned how to categorize in a B2C category tree kind of structure. And, I'm not going to diss people here. I think that's not the right way to go, but I will praise. So I think one of the companies I know of that's done very well, and I've talked about this separately, is a company like Supply House. Supply House is a major B2B company, and they do everything in a very B2C kind of fashion, where you can look at pipes in a certain way and see a category tree online and follow it. So I don't have to be the most brilliant person as a plumber to understand what they're trying to do and to follow it online if I have to place an order for some reason, right? I don't have to say, well, wait, where do I find this code number, and where's the sales guide, and where's the person, and should I call the 800 number? It's much more intuitive in a way that a B2C business would be intuitive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I've been following them for a long time since, I think I really kind of like started to get into this B2B e-commerce ecosystem in 2012, and it was fairly non-existent. And I think Supply House is one of the few out there that I remember seeing early on being like, hey, these guys are doing it right. Like, how can I help other companies do this? And what I think I've learned is it's a lot harder than than I thought to kind of help companies get to that level, because there's more to it than just building the infrastructure. There's so many things that goes into it. So yeah, I mean, we talked a little bit about the trends, and that actually you just kind of segued right into the next topic that I wanted to talk about is who's doing well in B2B commerce. Like, who are some use cases of companies that are doing well, and I think Supply House is a great example. Another one that I just want to quickly touch on is TruePar. They were actually on one of the few B2B e-commerce podcasts that I could find, the CEO of TruePar. And I believe they use Oro Commerce, which is a newer B2B e-commerce platform. And they've done a similar job to Supply House, where you can go online, you can see all the products, you can kind of get the consumer like experience, but you could still log in and build that kind of like B2B experience. What I think they've done really well is they use a company called Approve. It's a new kind of like tech startup, kind of like a B2B financing app. So instead of traditionally, a lot of these companies, you have to get an account with them, kind of work with them on a manual basis to get like maybe some corporate pricing, and go through this kind of like process to become a customer and get like logged in and get the correct pricing on the website. What Approve does is they kind of automate some of that process so that you can kind of automatically go through their application and get credit and financing through Approve. Approve takes on the risk, so the B2B company doesn't have to worry, and they can just kind of like immediately allow them to buy as a B2B customer programmatically. So they're doing that very well, and it's pretty cool to see that I think on the podcast they said 85% of their customers they never have to talk to, or it's fully automated.
No, that sounds like a dream. That number altogether for B2B. I mean, that's remarkable. If you can actually give people enough tools online so that they're able to go through whatever processes they need to, that's amazing, because that's just so unusual for a lot of B2B players. Still. To have a percent that's that high. I mean, that's amazing. But what I would say, what I would say too, just other folks out there, I mean, a lot of B2B service businesses I'm aware of are also I think they're ahead of B2B product businesses. Like B2B service seems to be a little bit ahead. Again, Can you
give me an example of,
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think a lot of players in insurance, for example, business insurance, it sounds so, dry. It's not something you ever get excited about, but you can easily find what you need. You can go out there, you can get it, get contacted with somebody, set up an appointment, you're done. I mean, it really is a lot easier than it used to be with like finding.
That's so true. I think we have like an online portal with our, for our company insurance, and you can like pay online, and it's kind of like more automated experience. And the more I think about it, you're right. A lot of these online portals for some of these, kind of services are actually getting more sophisticated.
They are getting, I think, better, and they've really think of even things like Rocket Lawyer. Rocket Lawyer is not for the average B2C kind of consumer. They're really B2B, and you go there and you can do all kinds of different legal agreements, contracts of all sorts. Pay either a monthly fee or a yearly fee, or pay per document you're creating. So sure, they have a B2C component, but it's become very valuable to small businesses. So they don't have to go out there and hire a lawyer and then get things reviewed and go through revisions. And so that's happened. Also, all of the, I would say, paycheck expense related stuff for small businesses, like companies like Expensify.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
taking pictures of receipts, uploading it, sending it to, having it linked to whatever your backend system is, and getting those paid. All that kind of stuff, I think, has moved along very, very quickly. B2B product has moved along, less quickly in my experience. I think B2B service, maybe it's the
Yeah,
only
and why do you? And it's funny that you say that, because why do you think that is? Because from a theoretical standpoint, selling a product isn't very new. In some ways, I think it's harder to automate these services. Why do you think it is that these product companies have lagged so far behind? We obviously talked about some of the reasons, but you think it's a cultural thing that they're just not? I think we see a little bit of that. I think that's part of the answer, but I'm just curious to hear your
part of it is culture. I mean, and again, we can bring this up to our listeners, in a future episode too. But I think that part of it is cultural. You just are in a business, and it is a literal legacy. Not just talking about legacy businesses, where people use that term, but it's literal legacy. You're doing something that maybe was 100-year-old business. It's been around for a very long time. You're doing something that has worked, right? I mean, think of it this way: your business has worked, and there have been upturns and downturns in the economy, and you're more resistant to change. Whereas it's a lighter touch needed, even in some of the service-related changes that have happened. I could come in and say, let me work with a lawyer who's a friend of mine and try to figure out how to do these online contracts, and use an existing tool to kind of get it out in front of people. It's a little bit different when you're working with all of the components for, I'll use again the example where I worked, an LED lighting manufacturer. They have, they make LED lights, headlights for car companies like BMW, and they make LED lights for Harley Davidson for motorcycles. And then they also make street lights, for communities around the world. All of this kind of stuff, they had focused, dedicated salespeople and sales teams, because they're different communities. But once they started thinking of these in the same way that people think of B2C, you have your online community, and they're, people in car headlights, it's the car headlight community. It's very specific, but there's no reason they can't just build, the pool of content and get people engaged there, and then have them, do things in an automated way. And that's what they did. It took a while. It took a lot of shaking people up, but the salespeople are happy. It doesn't mean that they had to leave. They just have a different way of doing what they were doing.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think what I kind of want to segue into is like, what are the different? Because I think there's a big difference between a manufacturer, and obviously it depends on their industry, and then you have certain distributors that don't necessarily make the product, and then you have like wholesalers that are kind of in between, distribution and consumer, retail. And I think a lot of those wholesalers, like a Costco, obviously, if you consider them a wholesale, they're like pretty far along with e-commerce relative to some of the companies that we're kind of talking about. So I'm curious, like, to hear your perspective, but from our perspective of the experience that we've had, the manufacturers, I think, are a little bit easier to ease into e-commerce because they can sell direct to consumer. So sometimes they'll kind of like start with that, and it's kind of like, hey, maybe they use Shopify or whatever it is, and they kind of like foray into the direct consumer a little bit. Obviously it depends on what they sell, or they might just kind of sell like a basic version of what they have to try and kind of automate like a piece of it. And it seems like that's a little bit of a lighter process. But I think once you start going into like, these large distribution, where they have like hundreds of thousands of products, but they don't necessarily make them, it becomes this like operational challenge that I think they're just not quite ready for internally to digitize that. And that's where I think we see a bigger challenge with some of these companies.
Well, you know, and again, I think all of these are worthy of like deep exploration. And that's one of the reasons that it's great, you know, that we're doing this podcast.
Yeah, I think they all deserve their own, like, we should probably talk about just this manufacturers and this one thing. What should they do? Because it's so much to talk about in that.
Yeah. But you know, you're absolutely right. I mean, but to touch on just a couple observations that I have, I mean, you know, I started in brick and mortar retail. Actually, I was a retail exec for Bloomingdale's and Macy's and some other places before I came into e-commerce long ago. So I was in that world. Think about how the retail supply chain works. And, you know, we don't have to go into great exhaustive detail on this, but, you know, you have wholesalers, you have manufacturers of clothing. Think of a Ralph Lauren, you know, and what happens? Like, he's making clothes. They're coming from all over the world. They're going to distribution centers to be sold at places like Macy's and Bloomingdale's and his own stores. And this was pre-online, you know, when I was there. And so where did the product go? It went all over the place, but they even had catalogs, you know, all of this. And then you have people who are buying it wholesale, you know, at Macy's or Bloomingdale's. They're buying this manufactured goods. They're buying it wholesale to sell. And then they have these specific agreements in place. Well, it's complicated now, right? So what does Ralph Lauren do? Let's think about just an example like that in you know, today's world. Ralph Lauren still exists. There's a massive B2C business. There's a massive B2B business. Massive. I mean,
Absolutely.
I think he makes, and I think this is a real number, I think he makes 8 million men's polo shirts a year. Like, I remember this from a conversation I had with somebody else.
And obviously those are sold through a lot of, you know, retailers that they sell to. Yeah.
Exactly. All over the world, different channels, different ways. So how do you manage that, right? Well, one thing they've done, and again, very few people see this because they don't interact with it. Like, as a consumer, you wouldn't know. But what they've done is that they have, you know, they do have a very sophisticated system where they funnel people in. Like, if you are contacting Ralph Lauren and you want to potentially sell, you know, men's polo shirts in your one-off boutique, there's a process to go through, and a lot of it is online. They ask you all these questions about your business. Are you appropriate? Are you the right size? Are you going to be competing with somebody who has an exclusive to that area? Whatever, right? They put you through that digitally, you know, quote unquote, online. They don't have you talking with somebody in person and meeting and sending paperwork back and forth. It's all digital now until you get to a certain step. So that's a model, I think, for a lot of people where it was complicated. There's so many different things going on. It's getting easier, and that could happen for anything. It doesn't have to, there's wholesale there, there's retail there, there's B2C and there's B2B. And they also have services. They do tailoring services and couture clothing and all this stuff outside of the product, right? So it's a big, big, big world. You can just rip apart one business like that and do an analysis, and it might be instructive.
Yeah, I agree. I think we might want to save that for a different podcast to get into like the different industries, because I think that's what makes it so complex, and that's why I'm so interested to do this, because I think with B2C, like I said, I think our B2C customers, besides, you know, obviously certain categories like apparel, you know, we're dealing with coronavirus, which is obviously like unprecedented. A lot of them are thriving right now because the playbook is simple. You know, they're on Shopify, they're on Magento, whatever it is, and you know, we advertise on Instagram, we target a certain ROI, return on investment. There's certain, like, this playbook that's working. And I think obviously there's nuances per industry, but with B2B, I think there's almost like, you almost need like a industry specific manufacturer playbook or industry specific distribution playbook that's kind of nuanced to their, you know, segment of type of B2B, right? As a, you know, type of company. Because some of these companies are not going to have the Ralph Lauren brand, so they can't necessarily. They might have less brand value. You know what I mean? So they have to kind of.
You know, there are universal lessons, and then there are all of these ones that are much more local, right? I mean, so I think that it's going to be kind of a movement back and forth. There's going to be a flow, where, you know, where we're sharing some things that are universal. They're going to apply to anybody who's listening, anyone, and I think that those are going to be gold. But there are also things that are going to be very, very specific. Like when we're talking about apparel, that is a world that's unto itself in a lot of ways. You have to understand
Absolutely.
how
Yeah.
it works, you know.
Yeah, but I agree. I think the more that I've done this, the more things that we learn in one industry can often apply to another. So, so yeah, just conscious of time. The other topic, you know, we talked a little bit about some of the companies that are doing well, and I think I'll kind of touch on that a little bit because I think there's more to talk about there. But I want to talk about what's stopping B2B companies from doing well in e-commerce. So from my perspective, I think a lot of it is expectation setting. Is they, you know, they might have some legacy e-commerce system. It's not really helping them as much as they need it to. So they're like, oh, we got to rebuild this. We got to modernize.
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of it is that they just they don't have enough experience. So their expectations are a little bit off. So a good example is I think I heard that Grainger was like the initial Grainger site that was kind of like one of the first big, you know, B2B distribution sites. I think it was like $6 million or $7 million or something like that. So you have all these other B2B companies going, hey, you know, we want to be like Grainger or whatever, but it, you know, obviously they don't have $6 million budget. So I think there's this challenge where you kind of have to like crawl, walk, run. And it's like, let's say you have $100,000, you know, where do you start with $100,000 in your specific, you know, subset or industry or use case? And I think you have to be kind of, I think that's what's stopping a lot of companies is they think that they, you know, we get a lot of RFPs and expectations that when you really think about it, it's like what they want is a $500,000 project, but they only have 100,000.
Sure.
So there's this big disconnect with the reality of what it's going to take to get over the hump. And you know, you might be able to get a really good, you know, provider to get some extra value, but there's a certain point where there's only so much you can do with so much money. And I think that you have to kind of like build this iterative approach. Like maybe you want to get to that $500,000 site, but maybe like you start with this base and you kind of build up to there. And I think a lot of B2B companies struggle with that mindset because they're not used to this kind of agile, iterative development process.
Well, I think you brought up a couple things that are going to be in the universal category, right? So that's something we'll have to just put on the side there. There are things that are going to be universals for all of our listeners. And the crawl, walk, run, you know, image is always a very useful one. You know, I think that what's stopping a lot of companies from progress is that they believe that they have to take a bigger leap than they really need to, or they've never taken the smaller steps. Maybe that's another angle to look at. You know, so what I've often said to businesses is that it's probably more important for you to have constant innovation, than to be thinking, what am I going to save up for 3 years from now, right? Because right? Because some businesses are just like that. They'll say, well, you know, we want to invest in a completely new set of, you know, tech and tools, and it's going to be a new platform. It's going to do this, and you know, we're like, oh, that's exciting. You know, how are you approaching it? Well, we're putting money away, and we're thinking about this, and it'll be $2 million in 2024, and that's not going to be the right answer for almost anyone. It really isn't. You know, it just.
I agree.
I mean, and the best example.
Because also by 2024, the whole market's going to change, and the platforms are going to change. Whatever you were starting to work towards might not be competitive anymore, and you kind of have to get some stuff out in the market and test it. And I think once you have a little bit more of a mature infrastructure, it actually gets a little bit easier, I think, to do those bigger projects, because you like we're actually doing a pretty major rebuild of our website, but our website was mature enough where we kind of knew what we wanted and we knew what we needed to do to get to the next level. But had we not had already a decent kind of infrastructure, I don't think it would have worked, this next kind of like big project. So I totally agree with that. Like I think if you're starting from a really basic level and you don't have something modern, trying to all of a sudden cram it into one big project, I just think that there's so much risk and room for failure there. And so much misaligned, like no matter what, as an agency like us, or, you know, and some of the companies I'm sure you've worked with, there's just like, it's almost impossible to set expectations in those situations because they've never done it before. And in their mind, they're going to get this like whiz bang thing, but they're starting from like almost zero. So I think, to me, what I think stopping companies is, what do you actually need to move forward? And to me, I think for most B2B, like let's start focus on the product, because like you said, I think some of
Sure.
the services, they're starting to get stronger, and they might have tech teams, and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of these insurance companies do have internal software engineers, but these product companies don't really have that. So I think what's stopping them is that they're trying to do everything all at once. And what if I were them, what I would focus on is just how can I come up with a good operational workflow, which probably includes tying into their ERP, because realistically, they're probably still stuck on their ERP. So that needs to kind of tie into the e-commerce and get good product data up on the website. So like, I think if you can accomplish and have a good long lasting system. So we typically like Magento because we feel like we can build upon it, and there's a lot of like room to kind of iterate on top of Magento. But it doesn't have to be Magento; it could be any system. I think that what's stopping them is it's hard for them to envision doing just that. Like they want to do everything, and so I really encourage companies to think like, hey, what if I just I settle on this system, and all I'm going to do is make sure I have a really good ERP integration that covers kind of the use cases and usability and functionality that my customers need, at least from a basic level, and get all the great product data into that system, and then have a little bit of my branding and design that makes it kind of like a nice, modern, responsive experience, but not much more than that, and just get that done. And then like maybe you iterate on that. Yeah, I think a lot of companies would be
I think it's the right
in a
lesson.
better place with that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the right lesson. It's absolutely the right lesson, because it's there are all kinds of terms that people use for it, but you don't want to be stuck. You don't want to get yourself stuck because you're trying to achieve something that's too big, that's going to take too long. You want your business to continue to to iterate, right? That's really a great word for this. It's not just innovation, it's an iteration. You're constantly doing something and then the next thing on top of it. And
Exactly.
that's really critical, because you're going to get a nice ROI out of that. You're always going to have a return on any of these improvements. And if you keep moving, that incremental improvement is going to really add up to something big. So got to just go. There's no waiting. You got to just go. What are we doing this week? What's happening this quarter? Those are the questions asked in almost any business. And if you don't have an answer to that, like what are we working on this quarter, that's a problem to begin with, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I know we're going to start to run out of time here. We're trying to keep it around 45 minutes, which we think is a good time for people to, so they don't lose too much patience listening for this for too long. So one thing I just wanted to touch on that I think is another big hurdle that we see with B2B commerce, and we probably should have an entire podcast around that, is one thing that we see that's stopping people is kind of like, they kind of go hand in hand, is pricing, and getting like a automated pricing structure that allows people to transact online. We see as a big hurdle where a lot of companies, and I think this was one time one of our clients got acquired by one of the largest biotech companies in the world. I can't speak to the details there. Don't want to break any NDA confidentiality, but it was pretty amazing to see some of these like massive billion-dollar companies, and they don't have any standardized pricing. So like, there's no way to really do B2B e-commerce, because everything still has to be kind of like individualized or quoted out on a one-to-one basis. And I think that really stops a lot of B2B companies from doing a better job with e-commerce, is because the pricing is just such a mess, and it's so one-to-one, and it's almost like, hey, well, we think we can charge this guy this much, and then we're going to charge this guy a different price just because, you're trying to, kind of maximize that one opportunity. It just doesn't scale very well online when you try and standardize pricing.
Well, just two quick observations on that. The pricing where it was one-to-one, I've seen that firsthand, and I think that one of the things that B2B consumers are happy about is that is going away, because it really it was just too much mystery. You didn't know if there were competitors of yours who were getting better pricing for something that you needed, because they were maybe had a friend there, because they had a bigger order that they were placing. The transparency is good all around. It's going to help every B2B commerce player, I think, over time, just to understand what the rules are. Is it quantity related discounts? Is it some sort of a system where there's a 1, 2, 3 from good, better, and best? and that's the way that I'm making my purchases. It really there needs to be a structure. It needs to be transparent. I need to know that as I grow my business, that I can get this many of this item for price X and save, right? I need to understand that. I don't need to be told that, oh, I didn't achieve X, so I can't get that deal because there's some secret thing happening behind me. So that kind of
Yeah, I
transparency
totally
is just
agree. And I think that kind of creating some sort of like almost like algorithm of pricing that people can understand, like, hey, if I buy 100K worth of product a year, I'll get this level discount. If I buy this many units of this product, I get this much of a discount. An example of a company that's done that pretty well, though they're very frugal with their discounts, is we buy a lot from Apple. A lot of our machines are Apple computers. Most of our employees use Apple, although we do have some people that use Lenovo, and they have like a B2B website that you have to get kind of set up on, and it's very clear, like if you order this volume, you'll get another level of discount. Discounts aren't amazing because it's Apple and they kind of can get away with not discounting very much, but like, okay, if I'm going to order this much, I can get another level of discount, based on how much my volume is. I'm sure at a certain point, if you're big enough, you may be able to kind of negotiate beyond that. And I think it's okay to have some level of negotiation at a very, very, very large size. But most of these companies, aren't buying in that level of volume where I think you can standardize it to the point to have some sort of
I'll just add one other relatable thing for our listeners. Panera. Panera, a lot of people are familiar with their food, and there are locations around the country and that you can order online. Not everyone is familiar with their big catering business, their B2B side, and they kind of treat it the same way as they treat people on their Panera Rewards B2C side. You get different offers, you get extra gift cards. You place a $500 catering order for your company from Panera, you get an extra $50 of X, for later. So it's a very clear system, a nice loyalty system, which is again a topic we can talk about for B2B later on, and parallels B2C, and it's very successful. I know that from the inside from people I've talked to there. It's a very successful program.
Yeah. That's a really good point. That loyalty, I think, is such a good topic, and I think with the amount of topics I think we can come up with for this, I don't think we're going to run out of topics and guests.
I don't think so.
So since we're running out of time, last thing I wanted to finish on is just because we're starting with the basics, and this is just kind of an intro to this podcast. What are some of the platforms that I'll obviously get into the platforms that we see are successful, and we have a little bit of a bias because we actually do work for some platforms and not for others, but we try and stay on top of the ecosystem. But what are some of the platforms that you see? I think most people aren't building custom anymore. I think we can agree that custom e-commerce site is, unless you have a huge budget or some amazing CTO, it's probably not what you're going to do. So you're probably going to use some sort of platform. So what are the platforms that you've seen be successful? And
well, I'll give you one that not everyone expects: NetSuite. NetSuite is very successful for B2B and B2C. For B2C, maybe even less so. It's complicated, right? I mean, so it's funny that that I'm even bringing it up, but I know it's successful for a lot of B2B players who also happen to have their hands in B2C. So NetSuite is certainly something to consider.
It's funny that you say that, because we've definitely been, interested in that ecosystem. We don't do a lot of work in that ecosystem, but what intrigues us, and we've done some work there, so we've got a better sense of the platform now, and we are happy with a lot of the things that they're moving towards, and I think they're moving in a really good direction. But they're one of the only platforms that I would say has a competitive ERP and so like kind of the back office tools that you need, but also the e-commerce for a B2B company all in one. So I think that's very powerful, and I think that solves one of the big hurdles that I think a lot of the companies that are struggling with, is they have this legacy ERP, but then they have to connect it to this other ERP.
That's exactly why I brought it up. Exactly.
Yeah. I agree with it. I think NetSuite is kind of it's an afterthought. I mean, I think the ones that we're seeing that are obviously common is Magento. I think Magento is very powerful, and there's a lot of value there. So we're seeing that be really successful. But some of the other ones that I think are interesting, I think BigCommerce has a lot of potential. I think because it's SaaS and because, it's a lot easier to implement than a NetSuite or Magento or some of these other, like a Hybris is kind of on the higher end. That's really, really expensive. And most people probably don't want to go down that path. BigCommerce is really interesting to us, and one that we are hoping to grow in more over time because they've got a little bit of a stronger catalog and kind of like customization. They've got a little bit more of like an enterprise focus than Shopify, and they have stronger catalog features. Like Shopify's catalog is a little limited in terms of some of the things that B2B needs. So we've seen some potential with BigCommerce. A couple other platforms, we don't do work with them, but they seem to be doing well. I mean, OroCommerce I mentioned with TrueCar. I think they've got an interesting thing going with, obviously they're the former founders of Magento. So I think there's a little bit of a beef there, but they've got a good thing going with B2B. And then Insight seems to be doing well. I don't know if you've seen much with Insight. They got bought by Episerver. They seem to be doing pretty well. I think they're a little bit more on the expensive side, but they've seemed to be getting some good traction. And then Unilog's another one that I think what they've done really well. I don't think they're necessarily as strong as like a Magento or even a NetSuite or BigCommerce or any of those as like just the B2C like features that really help a B2B company. I don't think they're as strong as that, but they have kind of like a PIM and product data service built into their platform, or into their offering, I guess is a better way to say it. So they'll help you get your product data. And so that's been a very strong offering for a lot of companies that don't have good product data. They'll actually help you with that part of the process and get it into the platform.
I think one whole episode really needs to be about low, mid, and high. Sort of just going through because really, everybody knows Shopify in a sense, and it really has a lot going for it. And then Magento kind of in that grouping, and then when you go through the spectrum, and as you said, you can kind of end up at Hybris and talking about NetSuite and why that might make sense if you have a budget of 5 million and you have these different things going on, right? So it's kind of a spectrum.
I totally agree. I think there's kind of a spectrum of like, okay, I got, under, this budget per year to spend right now. What do I do? When you're in that mid tier, I think you kind of start to think about different platforms. And then obviously in the high tier, you might be considering a Hybris, or whatever. Even I think Salesforce Commerce Cloud, they've started to take a B2B approach. I'm not super sure how happy people are with it, but they've got, I think it's like Cloud Craze, or they've got more of a now that they're part of Salesforce. It was Demandware originally, which is very retail, but now it's more B2B. I think they're trying to be everything because it's Salesforce. So
they are trying to be everything, and I think that's the if we get into the weeds, I think that's the issue. They are trying to be everything, and they were pretty good as Demandware. I thought they weren't so bad, right? So I'm not sure what's up now.
But they had their niche, right? There was like, what were the kind of companies that would be on it? It was those, Crocs, I think was like on there. I think it was like those kind of like retail, very successful, larger retailers. Mm-hmm. And now they've kind of, I think, become something more than that with Salesforce, obviously trying to get they're a public company trying to increase the shareholder price, and they want to hit the whole market, right?
Probably the only other thing you mentioned, which I thought was interesting too, is that, custom is really going away or gone away. Custom, even for top players, you might customize a platform, but you're no longer building something that's entirely custom. It is very rare to do that now, and I don't even see the need for it almost entirely.
I agree. And the last thing we'll leave everyone is, and I think the reason for that and why certain platforms are successful is I think you need an ecosystem. I think without an ecosystem around a platform, you're taking a huge risk. And it's because the reality is, like, over time, you're going to have different developers working on the project. You want your system to last for as long as possible. Let's say, we usually like to say 5 years. Like, if this doesn't last you 3 to 5 years, then I think you made the wrong decision, right? Like, you probably chose something that you outgrew too fast. And you want a platform that has an ecosystem because they might have payments, more payment gateway options, more apps, and all. No platform does everything. And it's kind of like you're like Approve. I mentioned Approve is that third party kind of B2B financing tool, and you don't have to reinvent the wheel with these big ecosystems. That's why Magento, I think, has been so successful. And Shopify and Magento, I think, have done the best job of that.
Yeah, I
because
agree.
you can use their app so easily. So I think that's a huge thing to think about when you make these decisions. So yeah, so we'll wrap it up at that, and stay tuned for our next episode. We're still in the early stages. Don't have a topic yet, but I think you'll be excited to see what we have next. So
I can't wait. I'm looking forward to this, and going to be happy to participate in this, listeners. Going to be very happy.
Absolutely. All right, thanks everyone. Stay safe out there.